managing users and database roles. So users are the equivalent of logins only at the database level. So with a login, we need to create a login in order to give an individual or group access to SQL Server. Users are tied to logins most of the time, and they give access to a database. And then database roles are the equivalent of server roles, only where server roles apply to an instance and all the things that an individual or group could do at the SQL Server level. Database roles determine what they can do at the database level, what actions they can perform, what permissions they're granted. So our primary focus in this nugget is going to be around database security. What users can access what databases and what actions they can perform in those databases. Checking out the Nugget overview, we're going to kick this Nugget off by jumping right into the Virtual Nugget Lab and learn how to create and manage users. We'll start with creating users. We'll create users that are linked to logins, both Windows authenticated and SQL Server authenticated logins. Then we'll take out how to create users that are not associated with a login. We'll look at contained database users and how that works. And then we'll also take a look at how to deal with orphaned users. And that really is if you have a bunch of users that you've created in a database and then the login associated with those users disappears, we now have orphan users. So how do we deal with that when that happens? And the best way to take action in case we need to restore some of those users, how do we do it? We'll also take a look at how to work with database roles, how we can assign permissions collectively at the database level. We'll also take a look at how to create our own database roles so we can determine what those collective permissions are. And at the end here, we'll look at how to create application roles, a way that we can create a role, give permissions to it, and then applications can assume the identity of that role when they work inside of SQL Server. All right, let's jump into the Virtual Nugget Lab and learn how to work with users and database roles. In the Virtual Nugget Lab, we have SQL Server Management Studio pre-launched, so let's bring it into focus. And I've added a project into our solution for the Series 18-Users database roles. We're going to start with how to create users. So let's open up the user script. And once again, I want to get you comfortable with using the interface prior to going through the code. So we've got a connection here to our eval instance. And if we drop down databases, whatever database you want to create these users to and potentially map them to logins, you'll need to go into the database. So in the database, there's a security node, much like we have a security node at the instance level, only this security node contains logins. The security node under each database contains users. So if we wanted to create a new user, we can just right-click on users and choose new users. So we have quite a few options in here to choose from. For instance, we can create a SQL user with a login. The first option here means we can give it a name, so we can call this something like Junior. And then in our login name, we can hit the build button that will allow us to browse all of the logins on the server. So if we hit browse, we have all the SQL and Windows authenticated accounts that we can associate with this user. So, and by the way, you can also do groups. We could tie this to our developers group if we wanted to. But for now, let's tie it to our Junior DBA login. So we'll hit OK here, hit OK here. And now you'll notice that you can name your users in your database different than the login they're associated with. Not that I advise it. I kind of like it when they're the same names because it makes it easy to associate them with their login. So keep that in mind. And pretty much from there, you can choose their membership, what database role they're assigned to. We'll go over these when we get to roles. And then again, you can, just like logins, you can get granular right off the bat here and start giving them specific permissions to specific objects. We'll talk about permissions in a future nugget and really just try to stick to roles from here and collectively assigning permissions. So let's not give them any permissions right off the bat here. That's it. Just create a login in the database and hit OK. So if we expand users, there is our Junior DBA database user account. Now let's get a connection to our eval instance as our Junior DBA user here. So here it is. And by the way, I added back view any database permission to the public role. If you're here for the logins nugget, logins and server roles were explicitly removed permission, so we wouldn't be able to see the Nugget Demo DBA. We would only be able to see the databases recreated. So I put that back on so we can see everything, but we're still only going to be able to access the databases in which we either created, in which we're the owner of, or in which we explicitly have permission to. So if we try any of these other ones, they're going to be inaccessible. The only ones we'll have access to is the test database because we created that one, and the Nugget Demo DB database because we just created a database user. But check this out. Where are the tables? They're not gone. Don't worry. They still exist because if we look up in our Nugget Demo DB, the same database just under a different account, we're logged in as our Nugget user account who has sysadmin privileges, all the tables are there. So they're there, It's just that our junior DBA user really has no permissions. We didn't give them any permissions. They really only have guest permissions, which basically means they can log in and access the database, but they can't do anything in it or access any objects within it. So let's just collapse this connection uh, under our junior DB account. When we get to database roles and what permissions they can do in here, we will come back. But for now, let's take a look at some of the other logins that we can create. So let's go back into our users node, right click and choose new user. So that was a SQL user with a login, a SQL user tied to an actual login. You can also do a Windows user tied to a login. That's what a Windows user is. So same thing that you just saw, just rather than tied to an existing SQL account, it's tied to a Windows account. So that's the same thing. The other one we have is SQL user with password. And this option is only available if your database is a contained database, which our Nugget Demo DB is. Now, if we were to do the same thing in our LOL database, just expand our users here, right click, choose new user, you can see this does not have the SQL user with a password. That's because this is just a standard database that isn't contained. We made our Nugget Demo DB contained quite a while ago in the beginning of the series, and it's been contained ever since then. So that's why we have the SQL user with password option. So if we wanted to create another contained user, like we have over here, our Nugget contained user, and a contained user has no external dependencies outside of the database. That's the whole point of a contained database. It doesn't rely on logins or anything about the server. So we can create a contained user, move the database to the cloud or another server or anywhere, and then anyone who wanted to log in under that account could log in by specifying the database. So server, database, and then the name of the account and the password. So if we wanted to create another contained user here, we could just call this Nugget contained user 2, give it a password, confirm it, and that's really about it. Everything else works the exact same way. So we can hit OK here, and now we have another contained user, just that it's not associated with a login. Let's go over the other user types in here. We'll just right click on user, choose new user. So we've looked at SQL user with a login, SQL user with a password, which is a contained user. We've looked at Windows user. A SQL user without a login is a very interesting one. This is a way that we can do impersonation. So we can take a block of code that we want to execute and say execute as this user. So this is a really easy way of doing it without having to manage certificates or asymmetric keys or logins. We can simply create a user. We can attach a stored procedure to this user. When we create the stored procedure, we can say execute as a specific user. And the beauty of this is it doesn't allow. We can really just create this at the database itself. So it's almost like an alternative to application roles. Only we can do it at the user level inside of the database. So it's really just a way to do impersonation. I'll show you how to do this in code. We'll create a user without a login. We'll execute some code as the user, and I'll even show you how to create a stored procedure and execute it as a user. So all you really need to do here is specify the username. That's it. Username, assign permissions to it, and then since we're the ones writing the code, we're the ones that are going to determine when code execute is going to execute on this user. So it's a very safe and secure way to execute, code that may be doing things that aren't normal or secure. Maybe you're doing sensitive things with code and you want to make sure that it's run under this user with specific permission. So it's really just a way to impersonate. The other options here is you can do a user map to a certificate. So if you want to give a user that's a login that's tied to a certificate, we can create the user here, specify the certificate that's tied to, and now we can start assigning permissions to that certificate user within the database. And same to the asymmetric key. So let's take a look at how to create users in Transact SQL. Then we'll take a look at how to manage them and really just manage orphaned users. And then I'll show you how to do impersonation by creating a user without a login. So first up, your standard way of doing security. Create a user that's associated with a login. Here's how we can create a user associated with a login that is a Windows group. So if we wanted to create a SQL Nugget Lab developers user based on our SQL Nugget developers group, which is a login that we already added into SQL Server in a previous Nugget, we can hit execute, and there we go. Now if we refresh our users node over here, where are you? You know what? See what I did wrong there? We were in the master database. You know what I did? I just did a big no-no here and just accidentally gave our developers access, you got it, to our master database. So that's why you always want to make sure you're in the right database before you execute code. Don't do that stuff in production. You'll get yelled at. All right, so let's try that again. Let's switch to Nugget Demo DB and execute it. But you see what I did there? To delete, it's very easy. You can just right-click and choose delete. The other thing you can do is hit drop user followed by the name of the username, not the account name or the login name, and that'll drop the user from the database. So now if we refresh our Nugget Demo DB, we should, there we go, have our SQL Nugget Lab developers. So all of our developers now have access to our Nugget Demo DB. So the next thing I want to do here is create Junior in our Nugget Demo DB based on the login Junior DBA. Let's see what happens here. Oh, can't do that. See that? Because we already created our Junior DBA account associated with this login. So what that proves is you can only have one user associated with a login. Now you can have many users across databases associated with one login. So we could still create Junior associated with our Junior DBA account in a different database. So if we wanted to create it inside of our LOL database, that will work. And you can even give it a different name. But you can only have in each database a user tied to one login. Now, something else we can do is, let's just switch back to our Nugget Demo DB, is create a contained user. And for this, instead of saying for login, we just say with password and give it a password. Now, keep in mind, you'll only be able to do this if the database you're in is marked as a contained database. So let's call this Nugget contained user 3. We'll hit execute. We'll refresh. And there we go. Something else neat I want to show you here with contained users that you can do is you can create a contained user based on a Windows account. So you would think for a minute there that this wouldn't work. Let's execute this. There we go. So we created the contained user in our Nugget Demo DB database. So the reason that worked is because it's a contained user. It doesn't rely on the server or logins. Because if we were to do this with a normal login, like so, and we tried to associate it with our Wacky Developer account, it wouldn't work because our Wacky Developer does not have a login. It has access through our developer's Windows account. So that's why this works. So as long as we're in our network, wherever that database may be, if we can be authenticated as Wacky Developer, we can now log in at the database level to our Nugget Demo DB database. Something else that's good to know how to deal with when it comes to security is orphan users. So an orphan user occurs when its associated login was deleted or dropped. So if you have a lot of users across many databases that were associated with that login and that login is dropped, now we have a lot of orphaned users out there that no longer have a login and can no longer get in to their respective database. So if we wanted to test this out, we could take our Junior DBA login, delete it, and we have a Junior DBA user in our Nugget Demo DB. So if we execute this, it's going to let us know that it owns some databases. So if your login owns one or more databases, we're going to need to change the owner. Another thing is you cannot have any existing connections. So I dropped our connection that we had down here from Junior DBA to our eval instance. Let's also change the owner of our test database that we created. So if we right click, head into properties in here, and head into files, here is the owner. So let's just switch this to, let's just say to ourselves here, our Nugget user database, or login. So that's good. That's good. Now we should be able to drop our Junior DBA login. There we go. So now we have an orphan user. So not only could we not access the database, but we couldn't even log in because that login no longer exists. So what we would need to do is recreate our Junior DBA login. So if we do that, you can see, let's head up here. We need to do that at the server level. There we go. Logins, and here's Junior DBA. Let's just refresh this and we'll see that Junior DBA is really gone. So let's recreate Junior DBA, and this looks good. SQL Server authentication here. Let's put the password back. Oop, I mistyped that last one there. Let's just do it all over again. Super complicated password. There we go. So everything looks good here. Server roles, we had them a DB creator role. And then that looks good. So let's hit OK. Now we have our Junior DBA user login back. But the thing is, we'll be able to log in as that Junior DBA user with the same password we had and the same credentials at the server level because we just recreated it. But this login that we just created is not associated with the user, the database user that we created above. So you'll need to relink those two together. And the best way to do that is flip to your database. So let's flip to our Nugget Demo DB. And then run an alter user statement. So we want to alter our user, and we did keep the name the same, so we'll rename that here. Junior DBA with login equals Junior DBA. This will relink them together, and now if we look at our Junior DBA login and we head into user mappings, we can see that we are mapped to the user in the Nugget DemoDB database. So that's the best way to do that. So if you do have orphan users, don't fear, you can certainly recreate the login and then reassociate all of your database users with that login. So reassigning orphan users is the way to go. That way, you're not recreating your database users and resetting up their permissions per database. That can be a time-consuming task. So this is Microsoft's recommended way of doing it going forward. We used to have a stored procedure that we could do this with that would reassociate a login with a user and auto-fix all of the mappings and such. But they actually deprecated that stored procedure, so I'll just mention it. I won't go over how to use it because this is a really easy way to do it anyway. Alter user, name of the user with the login, name of the login, and you're good to go. The other user type we can work with is a user without an associated login. So this is a good one to use as an alternative to certificates and asymmetric keys and even application roles, because we can create a database user that has no associated password. So again, you couldn't log in with this specifically, but what we can do is run blocks of code as this user. So this is good for those single database applications where you have sensitive information, but you do not want to grant specific users the ability to go into that sensitive data or work with those sensitive tables. What we can instead do is, if we need to get data out of those tables for that user, what we can do is take the block of code and execute it as our user without a login. And same with stored procedures. We can say, whenever the stored procedure executes, execute as this user. So what we'll do is we'll create this user without a login that has no password. And let's do that now. We'll create that user, and it'll look like any other standard user. If we go into Nugget DemoDB and drop down security and drop down users and refresh our node here, there is our app user account. And then we can assign permissions to this user. We can give them select permission on that sensitive table. And then whenever we execute that code to bring the data out of that table, or the stored procedure that brings data out of the table, we'll just execute it as a user. So we don't have to explicitly grant permissions to any of those sensitive structures to users, but we instead grant them to our user without a login. So what this will do here is we're going to execute as user app user. That's going to switch our current connection context to the app underscore user account. So any code we execute then will be executed under the context of that account. Then we'll revert, which will revert us back to our Nugget user account, which is a DBO. So we'll get the DBO whenever we do a select username. So we should get app user, then DBO. So if we execute this, there we go, app user, and then DBO. So which is us here, which is our SQL Nugget Lab Nugget user account. Same thing at the stored procedure level, only this time with execute as app user. And now, anytime we run the stored procedure, and let's just do an exec get current user, it should return app user, because that's who it's executing as, and that's the permission set that will be granted to any code that's run under that stored procedure. Now that we've seen all the different kinds of users we can create at the database level, let's move into database roles. And database roles work much like server roles do, just at the database level rather than the instance level, and they work against users rather than logins. So we have fixed database roles, which have a predefined set of permissions already associated with them. And then we have what are called flexible database roles, which are actually user-defined database roles, where we can define that set of permissions associated with the role. So let's get familiar with a couple of these fixed database roles, and then I'll show you how to add members into them. So if we head down to the roles node at the database level, here are the database roles. So if we expand these are all the fixed database roles, the predefined one that have predefined sets of permissions associated with them. Access admin, anybody that's a member of this role will be able to create users in the database, map logins to users, and give access to the database. Backup operator will be able to perform backup operations. Data reader and data writer will be able to read or write data to any user table in the database. DDL admin, data definition language, so anybody that's a member of this will be able to create, alter, drop, and work with objects at the database level. Deny data reader and deny data writer are explicitly taking away the permission to read or write data into any user table in the database. Think of DB owner as the system administrator here of the database. Anybody that's a member of this role will be able to do virtually anything here in the database. Security admin will be able to do what we're doing, assign users and members here to database roles, create database roles, work with permissions and what we call securables. And then the public role is kind of your generic role that everyone will be a member of that doesn't have much access. So if you want to add users into these roles, it's pretty straightforward. If you want to do it at the role level, just double click on your role. And down here with role members, we can hit the add button. And now we can browse. We can browse existing users or existing database roles. Keep in mind, the only database roles you'll be able to add to fixed database roles are user-defined database roles, or the public role being the only exception to that rule when it comes to other fixed database roles. Because you can see that here if you hit browse, you'll be able to see we have all the users and we have one role available to us. So you can add the public role to any existing fixed server role. Outside of that, you'll have to add user-defined, or as we call them again, flexible database roles. So that's it. That's one way to do it. Another way to do it is at the user level. So if we open up a user here, you can head into membership, and now you can add this user to one or more role members just by ticking the ones you want. And if you were to create your own, they would show up in here as well. If you want to add users to roles using Transact SQL, you have to use a stored procedure called sp_add role member. Specify your role, specify your database user, and we're good to go. So if we wanted to add our developers user that is linked to our developers login to our DDL admin role because they do development on the database, architect, whatever they need to do here, then we'll have to switch to our Nugget demo DB here, and then execute sp_add role member, and that'll add it in. Now if we look at our developers role and we head into membership, there we go, DDL admin. Now creating your own database roles isn't too bad at all. Most of the legwork is going to be defining what permissions you want associated with the role. So there's a couple of ways you can do this. We can head back down to our database roles node, right click, and choose new database roles. Here we could give it a name. So we call this DB devs. And then we could specify here who's a member of this role, and then we need to set up our securables. So I'm just going to hit OK here to create the role. And that was the same as doing this right here. Create role DB devs, because now we have a role down here. Now we can alter the role to add members to it, and we can also then grant what are called permissions onto securables. Now we've got a whole nugget dedicated, well I should say half a nugget dedicated to dealing with permissions, securables, when we talk about how to manage and troubleshoot security. So I won't go into too much detail other than showing you here how to just run a grant, and then the name of the permission, and then the table that we want to grant it to, and to the group that we want to grant it to as well. Or I should say the database role we want to grant it to. So if we run all these, we will grant alter permission to the sales archive table, view definition to the sales archive table, alter on employees, alter on sales, and then view definition on those as well. So if we hit execute, that will grant that permission set to our roles, and now we can add users into it. So if we hit execute, that'll add our developers user into that role. So if we go back into the role here, you can see we have developers as a member. If we head into securables, we can now see that we have alter on the employees table, the sales archive table, and the sales table. Something else I want to mention here before we get into application roles is the principle of least privilege. This is an exam objective. You'll probably see it on the exam somewhere. And it's really just a security strategy. And the whole idea behind it, and by the way, Microsoft recommends that you do this outside of SQL, but pretty much everywhere, Active Directory, SQL, anywhere there's security involved, they recommend you follow the principle of least privilege, which again just really says that users only have exactly the permissions they need to do their jobs, no more. And while that's great, it's going to take a lot more time and effort to come up with that security strategy and put it into place. And the reason I say that is because if you stick with database roles and server roles, somebody's bound to get permissions that they don't need, because it's kind of a big blanket way of doing it. It's the shortcut. It's the easy way of doing things, right? And like everything in the IT world, in life, when you take shortcuts, you're going to sacrifice, there's going to be cons to it. You're going to sacrifice something somewhere when you take the shortcut, where the principle of least privilege may take a little bit more time, may take a little bit more resources, but there's less cons. You'll be more secure in the long run. Now, what I like to do is come up with a hybrid model. Use database roles where you can and server roles where you can. You know, there's always a department that you know, even though you may have 10 people in it, their job functions are the same. Assign those people to your roles, and then the people that need a little bit more control over, like your developers and your DBAs, these are the people that are going to have varying levels of permission depending on their roles and responsibility. Have a little more control over them by giving them only what they need. So we'll take a look at how to get granular when we deal with permissions and securables in the nugget following this one. Now let's take a look at application roles. And these are neat. I've used these quite a bit in the past in previous versions of SQL Server when coming up and needing a simple way to assign security to an application. So what we can do, and these work just like database roles and server roles, they're just called application roles, but really we create a role, we can give it a password, that's how they're going to be activated, and then we assign permissions to the role. The big difference here is the role needs to be activated. So your application, or the developer that's building the application, will write code that taps into this role and activates it. So when they turn it on, the security context of the application will switch to this role, and it'll pick up the security context and all the permissions of this role. So it's kind of an neat and easy way to control permissions at the database level rather than at the application level. So you can move all of your security and access here inside a SQL Server, which is kind of neat, and it's an easy way to do it. So to do this, we create an application role, give it a name, give it a password. So let's do that. And you know what? We want to do this in our Nugget Demo DB, so we'll highlight that. There we go. And now once we have an application role, and just to verify that we do here, there it is. There's our application role. We can assign permissions to it. So we're going to say this application has access to only the employees table in our database. So we'll grant select on employees, grant insert on employees, update, and delete to our web app application role. So if we do that, now it has permissions. And so if we open up our application role down here, you can see there's the password. We can hit securables here, and you can see exactly what permissions they have assigned to them. So only the employees table, insert, delete, and if we head down here, update and select as well. And then this is where you can get granular and start doing your searching. If you wanted to add more permissions here to this application role, you could search for specific objects. Say we wanted to browse tables or store procedures or any database level object here. We could hit browse, and now we could specify other tables and the actions that this role can perform on those tables. So the real trick here with application roles is you have to turn it on. So the application will actually activate that role, and then the connection associated with that application will switch its context, its security context, to then whatever role we pass into our set app role. So they'll have to execute the stored procedure with the name of the application role, the name or the password, and that'll switch the security context. So let's test this out. If we just run select username, you can see we're currently DBO. Now let's execute the SP set app role, passing in our application role name and the password. That should activate the role, and now our security context for this connection has been switched to our web app application role. Now the thing with doing it this way, we're just calling setup role and passing these two parameters in. This connection is permanently stuck in the web app application role. There is a couple of parameters you can add to the SP underscore setup role. One of them is a cookie. So you'll need to turn the cookie flag on and then pass in a cookie variable as an output parameter that is a var binary data type. Once you do that, you can go back. You can call SP underscore unset app role, pass in your cookie that you got as an output parameter when you called set app role back into the unset app role, and that'll revert your security context back to the original context it was before calling set app role. So all cool and very useful stuff here at the database level. So just keep in mind, users are how we grant access to the database. Database roles are how we assign permissions to users or a group of users. And then application roles are how we can allow applications to have identity here in the database. So in this DBT Nugget, we got familiar with managing users and database roles. We started off with users and saw all the different kinds of users we can create. We can create users the traditional way, which are mapped to logins. We can create users without logins to do impersonation. We can create contained users that have no association with the server or a login as well and are simply meant for logging in at the database level, contained databases. We also got familiar here with database roles. We saw how to work with fixed database roles, how to create our own flexible database roles, and at the end here I got you familiar with application roles. I hope this has been informative for you, and I thank you for viewing.